Fair warning to all the other states, at this point in the narrative, the story is going to become increasingly focused on Melbourne and Victoria. Yes, I'm from and am in Melbourne, so I'm biased, and it's also what my thesis was about, so it's the story that I know best. In future episodes, I hope to fill out the giant nationwide gaps I'm about to leave in our history. Also, because there are so many companies and so many shows to cover, it's basically impossible to do them all in one video without making it just a scrolling list of names and dates. So I'm going to do it in stages over the next couple of episodes. The era of government-subsidised theatre began by calling itself the First Wave and the New Wave, its first few generations believing that their aesthetic and philosophical differences were enough to define new ages of Australian performance between them. In fact, of course, the First Wave never really called themselves that. They were cast as that by the New Wave in their effort to establish themselves as different from their forebears. At this point, I'm very tempted to do the, oh my God, the comedian's a bear. No, he's not, he's wearing a necktie, but I won't. I wrote it in, I took it out. I still did it. The story begins, at least my version of it, in 1938 with a small group of producers, critics, authors and amateur theatre managers who formed the Playwrights Advisory Board. Notable amongst the board's membership was Leslie Rees, who wrote a book called The Making of Australian Drama, in which he tells the story of the Playwrights Advisory Board. I'm not 100% certain I've seen it mentioned too many other places, but that's the trouble with Australian theatre history. A lot of it wasn't recorded or reported. Still, I wouldn't put it past Rees to have bigged up the board's involvement in everything that came next. That said, it's a neat framing device and nice detail, and one of the first visible ripples of the change that was coming. See how tempting fluid dynamics metaphors are. The Playwrights Advisory Board, with representatives from each of the states, would meet semi-regularly to talk about the theatre in their home states, discuss emerging playwrights of note, and work to find ways to encourage their development. Already sounds familiar, no? At the first meeting, they described their aims as being to secure for the Australian playwright a more prominent, profitable and honourable place in the Australian theatre, which is still a pretty fair mission statement today. One of the chief ways they found to encourage the development of Australian playwrights was to offer an annual playwriting competition and award. The best play received £75, and among the winners had been Dorothy Hewitt and Dimphna Cusack. For the 1955 competition, along with the prize money, the winning play was to receive a fully staged production by a new local theatre company in Melbourne. The artistic director of that company, doubtless trying to help grow the local industry and to find new talent for his stage, was English director John Sumner. The 1940s globally were dominated by fighting and then recovering from the Second World War. In Australia, this manifested in a range of complex ways that included a growing demand for a national theatre. Theatre itself began to be seen as an expression of culture and tradition, values understandably reassuring after a global conflagration in which 50 to 80 million people died. To this day, of course, Australia does not boast the kind of national theatre being called for in the 1940s, and occasionally still to this day, in the sense that a national theatre is a peak body, a cultural institution, and an arm's-length non-government organisation. Perhaps it was this post-war feeling of the need to belong and to demonstrate that belonging that led to the overwhelmingly popular response to the tour of the Old Vic Theatre Company from London. In 1948, led by Laurence Olivier and Vivien Leigh, already both stars in their own right, the company toured Australia for 7 months with The School for Scandal, Richard III and The Skin of Our Teeth. And the popular reception of the tour caught the attention of the head of the Department of Post-War Reconstruction, Dr. H.C. Nugget Coombs. The government had already received several submissions arguing for the establishment of a national theatre from the National Theatre Movement, the People's Council for Culture, J.C. Williamson's and various high-profile private citizens. A committee was set up to respond to these demands and was of the opinion that a national theatre company was more important than a building, which for the most part has not been the subsequent practice of most government subsidy. Though the Prime Minister of the day, Ben Chifley, was not immediately enthusiastic, seeing a national theatre as a sinkhole for money, Coombs successfully lobbied to import an expert in theatre to consult on what a national theatre for Australia might look like and how to go about setting it up. Together with the British Council and the newly formed Committee for Cultural Development, Coombs arranged for Chifley to see the work of the Old Vic and to chat with Olivier after the show about his views on a national theatre. All of this culminated in 1949 with English director Tyrone Guthrie being invited to conduct a rapid tour of the Australian capitals and submit a report on the potential for a national theatre in Australia. His recommendations largely boiled down to send your actors to England so they can be taught how to act properly and bring English theatre companies out to tour Australia so local audiences can learn what proper theatre is. His advice was not particularly well received by the theatre community of the day, the national commercial companies and the smaller independent entities. In the meantime, Chifley had lost the 1949 election and been replaced by the Conservative Robert Menzies as Prime Minister, and so the project of a national theatre was shelved for the time being. Not that this would deter Coombs, who would continue to lobby in the background. On the other side of the planet, in 1952, John Sumner was working as a stage director for H.M. Tennant's West End Theatres in London. At the same time, a small selection panel of English experts had been asked to look for a suitable applicant for the position of manager of the Union Theatre at Melbourne University, and had appointed Tyrone Guthrie as its chair because of his recent experience with the colonies. Guthrie is said to have told Sumner on his application for the job that if he took the job, he would be in a wilderness on his own. Undeterred, on landing the job and relocating to Melbourne, Sumner soon realised that the university's theatre was not in constant use throughout the year, sitting dark in the weeks between student productions and graduation ceremonies. By arranging all the productions into a contiguous season, he cleared roughly half of the calendar and, to fill that theatre during the time, founded the Union Theatre Repertory Company. Members of the company in these first years included Zoe Caldwell, Alex Scott, George Fairfax and Leo McKern, and their first production was Jean-Henri's Colombe. At this time, in the 1950s, there was no dearth of small to medium semi-professional independent theatre ventures in Melbourne. Most notable were the St Martin's Little Theatre run by Hal Percy, Brett Randall and Irene Mitchell, Frank Thring's Arrow Theatre, and the radical political work of the New Theatre, all competing with the massive commercial interests of J.C. Williamson's and the vaudeville-style Tivoli circuit. These smaller, more artistically focused companies tended to view the commercial work offered by the established entertainment industry as unsophisticated and attempted to distinguish themselves by the quality of their work on artistic and cultural merits alone. During these early years establishing the Union Theatre Repertory Company as part of the landscape, among other things, Sumner agreed to stage the winner of the 1955 Playwrights Advisory Board's annual competition as part of the UTRC season. The board considered 130 plays that year, and the quality of submissions was considered so high that a single winner couldn't be chosen, and so joint winners were announced. One of the winning plays was The Torrents by Oriel Gray, a terrific play about women battling institutionalised sexism in the workplace, which is still remarkably and sadly relevant today. And the other was The Summer of the 17th Doll by Ray Lawler. Yeah, here it is, finally the play that everybody always makes such a fuss about. It is a good play. It needs a bit of thought to stage it right, but what good play doesn't, right? Though the Playwrights Advisory Board couldn't make a decision between the two plays, only one production had been promised, and the two winners couldn't share it, so the decision which would be staged was left to Sumner. Summer of the 17th Doll is regarded as a watershed moment in Australian playwriting. Because a lot of how we have preserved our memory as a community has been through informal oral histories, it's come to represent more than just a high point in our history. It's become a kind of literal starting point. It's not uncommon to hear it said that before Summer of the 17th Doll, there was no Australian theatre. That everything which had existed before had been international works brought to Australia with Australian actors affecting English or American accents. The success of the Summer of the 17th Doll was seen as a demonstration that Australians could finally stage and write a good play, especially when the London tour was comparatively just as successful, despite the condescending tone to the critics' praise. One London critic even goes so far as to say, "It's taken a long time, but the kangaroos must be smiling today. Pardon me while I grind my teeth." Summer of the 17th Doll tells the story of Roo, the ageing cane cutter, and his ever-loyal mate Barney, who returned to Melbourne for their final holiday season with Roo's long-term, long-distance girlfriend Olive. It's been staged a lot because it's the cornerstone work of a particular story of Australian theatre and Australian cultural development generally, and so it has been and can be made to say a lot of things. In the way of great drama, such as these things are, it is broad and speaks to the humanity of its characters. In particular, for me, it speaks to a kind of strangled white Australian masculinity and youth, and the failed promise of white Australia. I imagine there will be some people who will not love that description of the play, and this is what the comments section is for, people. The play went on from London to an unforgivingly short run on Broadway, where it was a critical and commercial flop, reputedly because the American audiences couldn't understand the Australian accents and idioms. Arguably, this view of the Summer of the 17th Doll underlies the project of what would become known as the First Wave, to supplant the commercial theatre culture with a subsidised repertory theatre model. Its success with local audiences and English critics came at a crucial time for Coombs's national theatre project. Since the Guthrie Report and the election of Menzies, Coombs had been working to secure support amongst high-profile Australians in the cultural and corporate sectors for a national, non-government organisation to raise money for the support and development of Australian theatre and performance. With the impending coronation and visit of the soon-to-be Queen Elizabeth II, Coombs branded his project the Australian Elizabethan Theatre Trust to honour the new Queen and to capitalise on the largely pro-English sentiment in Australia at the time. It surely can't have hurt his cause that Prime Minister Menzies was such an avid royalist he'd penned and published his own poem professing his love for the monarch. Established in 1954, the Trust raised an initial £100,000 from the public with a matching 1 to 3 contribution by the government to be distributed to artists, support artistic projects and, crucially, to establish infrastructure for a national theatre community. Its first act was to appoint as its executive director the English director and administrator Hugh Hunt. Under Hunt's guidance, projects established by the Trust included the Elizabethan Theatre, a venue in the former Newtown Majestic Theatre, the Australian Drama Company, a classics-based theatre company that toured Shakespeare and his contemporaries for 2 years before folding, the Trust Players, a company working out of the Elizabethan Theatre presenting classics, modern, international and local work, and the Young Elizabethan Players Company, performing mainly cut-down Shakespeare work for schools. These would be the last attempts of the Trust to set up anything like a national theatre company. Elsewhere, though, throughout the rest of the decade, Robert Quentin from the Old Vic is setting up the Elizabethan Trust Opera Company, which would become the Australian Opera, and the Borovansky Ballet Company is about to become the Australian Ballet Company when Borrow dies and leaves the company to now Dame Peggy Van Praagh. In the meantime, flush with the success of the summer of the 17th Doll, the Trust committed to the production of new Australian writers in what was for then a serious way. Producing or supporting Richard Benyon's Shifting Heart, Douglas Stewart's Verse Drum and Ned Kelly, with design by Sidney Nolan, Peter Kenner's The Slaughter of St. Teresa's Day, Alan Hopgood's The One Day of the Year, and Patrick White's The Ham Funeral. Not a lot of women, I'm sure we're noticing in that list. This was not a great time to be a woman or a person of colour if you wanted to see your plays being produced. There were some produced by fantastic writers whose work is still very relevant today, including Catherine Susanna Pritchard, Oriel Gray and Mona Brand. Shamefully, the same cannot be said for writers of colour of the period, though the migrant experience was at least starting to be represented sympathetically with plays like The Shifting Heart. Still, when contrasted with the blatant racism on display only a generation or two earlier, in works with titles and premises so vile I can't actually bring myself to say them, for the time it was a step forward. Throughout its active years, the Trust gave shape to Australian theatre company administration, community management, training practices and canonical aesthetics. Value judgments and cultural assumptions are baked into the community at this point and remain with us now. Though we didn't accept any of the Guthrie Report outright, we learned its lessons very well and internalised and replicated their structures, systems and values. One of the most long-lasting and arguably most influential projects initiated by the Trust was the National Institute of Dramatic Art. NIDA was the first full-time training institution for the performing arts in Australia and was modelled on the English training institutions, primarily RADA. Founded by Robert Quentin in 1958, it initially offered 2-year courses in acting and production. Approaching the 1960s, with Hunt returning to London, the Trust becomes less invested in productions and more focused on partnerships with other organisations and presenters, both touring and locally, and also on phasing in a grant program for theatre companies in state capitals. This was intended to encourage medium, small and even amateur companies to form a cooperative network. The Trust's work at this time helped to buoy companies like the UTRC in Melbourne and the newly established Old Tote Theatre Company in Sydney, and also set the pattern for a nationwide network of state companies that would act as an effective surrogate for a national theatre. Heading into the 1960s, Australian theatre was on the tipping point of the government subsidy era. Commercial theatre management structures were struggling to make the transition into the post-war world, and so couldn't take the risks involved with the kind of network development required to establish a national theatre infrastructure. The new Repertory theatre and partial government subsidy model, on the other hand, had established itself and delivered what it was in a position to describe as results. Through the 60s, they got on with business as usual. National infrastructure for the performing arts grew, companies like Theatre 62 in Adelaide and Hole in the Wall in Perth began to assume the place that state companies would eventually fill. And the festival culture of Australia begins with the establishment of the Adelaide Festival in 1960. By this point, the Union Theatre Repertory Company had finally outgrown its home in the Union Theatre at Melbourne University, and so moved to new premises, a former industrial workshop and home of the Australian Church, on Russell Street. Nearly 20 years on from their founding, they were also feeling like they'd outgrown their name, and were in the process of rebranding themselves as the Melbourne Theatre Company. But the tenor of the times was one of cultural upheaval, civil rights and the rise of youth. The establishment culture in Australia, the people who in the 40s and 50s had had the influence and capital to be able to set up a national, semi-subsidised repertory theatre network, no longer had the same kind of cachet by the end of the 1960s. Furthermore, they themselves were vulnerable to the rhetorical strategies that they had employed against the professional commercial networks. And the students, who had been taught by the institutions and schools that they had set up, the self-described new wave, were about to start a revolution of their own. But more on that in our next episode. So what do you think? Did John Sumner, Nugget Coombs, Robert Quentin and Hugh Hunt wrest theatre from the hands of J.C. Williamsons and give it back to the Australians? Or did they begin a well-meaning process of cultural deforestation that would ultimately lead to the Brandis raid in 2015? I know what I think. I'd love to hear what you do. Leave your thoughts in the comments section below. Next month, the APG and Playbooks.